Greetings to everyone. Whatever time zone you are in, you have arrived at the second day of Facing Climate Change, the 2022 International Gathering in the conference series Focus on Conservation. We had a wonderful discussion yesterday with our speakers and our presenters and amongst ourselves in breakout rooms, and hope to have the same today. My name is Katja Zeliat, and I head international outreach activities for the Leibniz Research Museums. I will be your moderator for Facing Climate Change over the next 3 days. Just to make sure we're all on board, here are the most important things you need to know to participate fully and effectively in the conference. If you heard this yesterday, I apologize, but new people are coming all the time, which is exciting. And I just want everybody to be on the same page. Please make sure you've installed the latest version of Zoom. Most parts of this conference are being recorded and will be made available to you on the University of Cambridge Museum's YouTube channel in the future. To that end, please turn off your video when you are part of the audience. As you know from your conference materials and from the disclaimer slide you saw when you entered this Zoom meeting, you are granting the organizers rights to use your picture if you do not turn off your video. To allow for good sound quality, so please turn, great. To allow for good sound quality, we will mute all audience members during dialogues and sessions. If you have any issues hearing, seeing, or communicating during the sessions, please place these administrative problems into the Zoom chat to everyone, not to any specific person. Rest assured, we have helpers standing by. Do not place content questions into the Zoom chat for everyone. Thanks. To pose questions to speakers during the question and answer period after the dialogues and the sessions, don't use the Zoom chat. Instead, please use the Slido questioning and polling tool. You should have some information about Slido, and hopefully you've already logged in. So to get warmed up, let's take the day's first poll. Please go to Slido and enter the code Facing Climate Change, all one word, to take part. All right. Hopefully you can see the exciting poll question and put your answer there. We hope that you participants see this conference as we do, we the organizers. It's a conversation, and that means it may take some unexpected twists and turns. We hope that you will be inspired and empowered by this meeting. So in the spirit of an open and positive conversation, it goes without saying that we must treat everyone with courtesy and respect. We are excited to have delegates from so many different places and time zones, and we want to make sure that this digital meeting works for everybody. So please do let us know if you're having technical issues. Most of all, have fun, and thank you so much for joining us. I don't see very many people having answered the Slido poll. Let me see. I'm going to answer my Slido poll. Perhaps that will encourage. There we go. Quite a few. Excellent. More and more all the time. I see Belgium, Netherlands. I see Facing Climate Change as a country. I think that's a world problem. All right. Now let's start the opening dialogue, and please continue to use Slido to ask questions as the dialogue is happening, and our behind the scenes magicians will formulate them into questions that I will then pose to both of our speakers. All right. We will start with Amanda Pagliarino. Please turn on your video.
Good
Amanda,
afternoon.
good day. Amanda Pagliarino is the Quagoma Head of Conservation and Registration at the Queensland Gallery and Gallery of Modern Art in Brisbane, Australia. Amanda is interested in supporting the conservation profession to adopt climate active practices and publishes on the topics of climate change, climate projections, and energy efficient collections management. Also, we have with us Stefan Simon. Stefan Simon has been the director of the Ratgen Research Laboratory with the National Museums Berlin since 2005. He is a leader in the advancement of sustainable conservation strategies triggered by global climate change and a passionate and active participant in the Green Museum movement and the international culture in crisis debates. All right. The way in which we're going to do this for our participants and audience is that I think, Amanda, let's take you first. Just talk a little bit about who you are, what you're doing, what it relates to today's topic, and then Stefan will do the same, and then we will have a kind of back and forth between you. Hopefully, I won't have to jump in, or I will jump in if I feel so moved. And we're delighted to have you. Take it away.
Thank you. So I'm joining today because I've been very involved in developing the AICCM environmental guidelines. This was an undertaking that took several years, included a lot of research and testing before AICCM published a 2 climate zone environmental guideline. We've recently just updated that guideline a couple of months ago, so I'll be able to talk about that as well. So my background is in sculpture conservation, and I now manage the conservation and registration departments at the Queensland Art Gallery and Gallery of Modern Art. We're predominantly a contemporary art gallery, and we collect from the Asia Pacific region. We also have an international collection as well, and a very large Australian Indigenous collection. And we operate out of 3 buildings, and all of those buildings operate a little differently. So I'm very interested in how we utilize our facilities in a very energy efficient way. Maybe I can hand over to Stefan now.
Yeah, good morning or good evening, Amanda. Good morning, everybody. Apologizing for joining the meeting a little bit late because I had a software update on my computer installed by my employer. Couldn't really get around it, so apologies for being a little bit late. Yeah, I'm a conservation scientist or a heritage scientist, as we call this, trained as a chemist many years ago. And running the Ratgen Forschungslabor, the research laboratory of the National Museum and the Prussian Heritage Foundation here in Berlin since 2005. Well, many years ago, I don't even know when, maybe 10, 15 years ago, we started in Germany the debate about the Green Museum, set up a conference series which takes place every 3 years, every year in 3 cities, German-speaking cities, Austria, Switzerland, Germany. Where we're discussing the challenges for museums, archives, libraries towards the climate crisis and how we can deal with this. And so, of course, also in our country have been debates about climate corridors, the plus-minus dilemma, right, as was called in Milwaukee many years ago by the American Institute for Conservation. The current energy crisis has fueled this debate a little bit, you have to be careful. And now we are all in Germany actually calculating climate corridors, energy consumption by museums. And as we realize that two things, that the climate crisis is probably the biggest challenge we've ever been facing, which will change our landscape tremendously over the next decades, and which will not stop at the doorstep for our museums. That's, I think, a big takeaway from this debate, because for many years I had the impression that my colleagues in the museum world consider climate change to be taking place on planet Mars, but not here. This is changing. And also the energy crisis, the current energy crisis, is forcing us to be more creative and more quicker actually in our reactions to it. And with climate crisis being such an important topic, I think yeah, it's very welcoming, this debate on facing climate change. Always thinking it's a little bit too late, but yeah, we're in for this, and I'm happy to see the efforts in Australia. And we also have, of course, efforts in the United States with the revised ASHRAE chapter 2019. We have many international recommendations from the ISC, ICOM common, the common recommendations from 2014. We have now in Germany, by our Museum Association, a new recommendation on climate corridors, which I think may not go far enough. But well, this is all in flow, and let's see where we can take it from here.
Stefan, could I just ask you to explain what a climate corridor is?
Yes, thank you, Amanda. This is actually the question which is always coming up in radio and TV and newspaper interviews. When I say, oh, the climate corridors are too narrow, then people think this is a long hallway in our museum, which goes like, for 100 meters, is totally dark, and well, maybe actually quite similar. The climate corridor, or this plus minus dilemma, is a debate we have since we actually have HVAC systems and climatization systems in our museums. Engineers have to tell the system what kind of relative humidity, what kind of temperature do we really want to have? Where is this sweet spot of a good museum climate, right? I mean, too dry is not really good because some materials get brittle. Too wet is not good, or too humid is not good because we have a risk of mold. Too warm is not good because, chemical reactions double in speed every 10 degrees of temperature increase. And then we have too cold is not so good, not necessarily for our objects, but for our, safety and workers regulations, where we have a minimum temperature in Germany of 19 degrees by law. And so in between these parameters, this is the corridor. What is the minimum humidity? What is the maximum humidity? What's the minimum temperature? What's the maximum temperature? And the thing is, which we observe since, I think, at least since Gary Thompson wrote his famous book about the museum environment in the late 1970s, we see that we want to have a very narrow corridor, because people think, conservatives, museum directors think, that the more narrow this corridor is, the safer it is for our collections. Actually, it was a conference in the Dörner Institute in Munich in 2012 under the title "Stable is Safe," and which is in fact quite true, a quite true statement. But we also have to acknowledge that we don't have this climate corridors. We didn't have these climate corridors before we had climatization systems. And I don't know about Australia, actually, but in Germany, we have that since the 1960s. Late 1960s, we have climatization systems. And since then, we actually believe that we have to be in the middle of this corridor. And maybe we can talk about this, how much this is a legitimate corridor, or because, of course, one thing we should know in terms of the climate crisis and energy crisis is that the more narrow this corridor gets, the more energy consumption you have. And energy consumption and CO2 emissions, carbon footprint is increasing not linearly, but exponentially, the more narrow you are actually aiming at this corridor to be.
Oh, that's a great explanation. Sorry to jump in there, Katja.
No, please go.
So we would call, so just for others who are unfamiliar with the climate corridor term, we would refer to that as the neutral zone, or the set points, or the dead bands. So there's different ways that people have been referring to these very strict parameters that we feel we have to adhere to in the museum industry. So in Australia, yes, I think from, the 60s, very much, there were strict guidelines around these parameters for which we needed to run HVAC systems to look after collections. And so the AICCM has, prior to 2018, didn't have a formal position on environmental guidelines for cultural collections. So the 2 climate type guidelines for temperate and humid was the first time AICCM had really taken an approach to publishing a position on that. Prior to that, we were quite Eurocentric or Northern Hemisphere centric in the setting of those guidelines, 45 to 55% RH, which for Australia, which is a warm, hot, humid country, we do have arid zones and we do have high alpine freezing zones as well. But the greater proportion of the population, and therefore the majority of cultural heritage collections in capital cities, are in the warm to hot, humid fringes of the country. And we, for a very long time, were maintaining this very tight parameter, 45 to 55% in a humid country. It is very energy inefficient, very difficult for HVAC systems to manage that parameter, particularly if you're in a heritage building which has been retrofitted with an air conditioning system. They usually don't operate terribly well, even in broader parameters, but trying to maintain them in narrow parameters is quite difficult. So yes, we've been grappling with the same kind of issue for a very long time, and I agree with you, Stefan. There's really no more time. It's you need to be an energy efficient museum, or we're heading towards dangerous circumstances. Certainly in Australia, the most recent research out that was published by the CSIRO, which is our national science agency, and it corresponds with the research published by the IPCC. The Australian continent has warmed by 1.47 degrees Celsius since pre-industrial times. And so we're ahead of the global average, which I think is 1.15. So we're already hot. And if you're talking about, a few degrees change in the environment of your museum and you're worried about, rate of deterioration, well, how can you reconcile that when already the continent is nearly 2 degrees warmer?
Yeah, exactly. We all know, I think this is an important thing to remember, that many scientists and the IPCC reports and in Germany, in Potsdam, the Klimafolgeninstitut and others are telling us that we have just this decade for really tremendously reducing our carbon footprint by 50%. This is what we think is the precondition. And if we want to reduce our carbon footprint by 50%, even if we switch, to more and more regenerative energy sources, we need to radically change the system we're running our museums, and not only running, but also building. I think I don't know how many museum professionals are here, and I myself work for a museum, but I really think the best museum you can build now is the one which you're not building. And that sounds really not very nice for many people who are responsible for these decisions and who want to cut these golden ribbons when they're opening a new building. But we have to listen to all those young people. Also, we're now in the streets. I don't know about Australia. In Germany, we call them the letzte Generation, the last generation. They are seeing clearly that the political system, the decision makers, and this goes down to museums too, do not act responsibly by, first of all, building more and more new museums, and secondly, by running them with those tight climate regulations. Because we also should, I think that's part of my research for the past 10 or 20 years, also my time at Yale, when I was director of the Institute for the Preservation of Cultural Heritage, that when we look at why heritage gets lost globally, this is not because the climatization system is too narrow or too broad. These are reasons like fire, war, natural and human catastrophes. And as I'm saying, climate change and climate crisis is about to change this landscape so deeply and so profoundly that if we're not acting also as a museum community by reducing significantly and radically our carbon footprint, we don't have to have museums in 50 or 60 or 70 years anymore, because there will be no people who will enter these museums. And this always sounds a little bit dramatic, but this is what you what you can only conclude when you're reading the reports of the scientists of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change of the United Nations, the IPCC reports. This is what clearly comes out of this. So we have to be creative, and we have to finally also move our sector and consider what are the real risks, the real dangers for cultural heritage, because this is our job, right? To sustainably preserve cultural heritage for future generations.
Absolutely. And it's, the research that is coming out now, is available now, it's quite frightening and almost paralyzing. So I would encourage anyone who's working in a museum or gallery that is operating a HVAC system to start the conversation and move ahead very soon, right now, in fact. It's not that hard to move to broader parameters. I can share the data that I've collected. We tested broader parameters before the AICCM published the 2 climate zone environmental parameters. So I tested out the idea of the humid parameter, which was 45 to 65% RH. 65 seems to be worrying for anyone who feels their organisation is in a temperate zone. But in Australia, actually, you're in a hot to warm, humid zone. So you're living in a humid environment anyway. So it's actually not. It's not a difficult thing to do. So when we tested the broader parameters in our Gallery of Modern Art, we did that in 3 spaces over a 4-month exhibition. And we discovered that moving from 50 to 60% RH to 45 to 65, we gained considerable stability. I mean, nearly flatline stability from constant correction, lots of fluctuation, lots of energy being consumed in trying to maintain this narrow parameter. We switched to the broader parameter and we got a beautiful flat line that really floated between 55 to 60% RH. Mm-hmm. We didn't go to 65%. We didn't go to 45%. It just allowed the system to stop correcting itself. Mm-hmm. And we gained incredible stability. So I think people don't, it's, HVAC systems are complex. They're hard to understand, and it takes a bit of courage and conversation with the right people to, to test it out. Every building is different. Every HVAC system is different, but there's a huge amount of professional knowledge in the conservation profession about how materials respond. It's learned knowledge over a long period of time. Talk to your HVAC technicians, talk to your facilities people, talk to your collection managers, get them all together and test out a space, and you'll discover just the incredible benefits you can gain from broadening your parameters.
Definitely. I couldn't agree more. I think when we talk about climatization, I think the first thing we should know is that actually, which plays a little bit against us, is that the more technology, the more technique you're building in a building, the better you get paid, these engineers and architects. So actually, it's not rewarding to work on passive climatization or passive methods. However, and that's not a new thing coming out of the Radkin laboratory. This is something which was endorsed by the ICOM Committee of Conservation in 2014 with the IIC, in the ASHRAE standards 2019, and also earlier, that you have to consider your building as your first mean of control. And you have to aim at stabilization of your collection without taking recourse to climatization systems. This is written in recommendations. This is not a new thing. So consider your building as the first mean of control. That means also, if you're building museums out of glass and steel, and with all this, very modern concepts of openness, light, opening, welcoming, open rooms, that is a total contradiction to what a museum actually should deliver. The best museum in terms of climate would probably have no windows, no doors, thick walls, no isolation to the ground, no air exchange with the outside environment, and most importantly, probably no visitors, right? So, you don't open the door. Well, that's not what we want to have, because museums should have visitors. So we have to reconcile these aspects. But I think by building, this is already the first really important point we should take into consideration, that building a building or constructing a building which can take care for the climate without sophisticated and technological systems. And then in the second step, also because of course when you're building a new building, you have to consider all the gray energy which is in this building, right? All the CO2 which is emitted by burning your cement, which cement would be the number 3 on the emission scale, and the 3rd largest country after the United States and China, if you consider it as a country. So concrete is the first problem. Second, of course, steel. You need hot temperatures. Glass, you need hot temperatures. You need to emit a lot of carbon, and so people like colleagues like Max Page in Boston have been writing years ago already that if you build even the best museum, the most sustainable museum, the platinum LEED standard, or I don't know, in Australia probably BREEAM, right? The UK system of BREEAM, or in Germany it's called B&B. If you really build the best building, it will still take decades, maybe 70, maybe 80 years until such a building comes to equal with a building which is already existing, just because of the gray energy embedded in the structure. And then of course you have to look at the running of your museum. And as you're saying, allowing that band zones, going away from single point settings to dual point settings is we did this at Yale. We saved 20% in one of our museums, the Peabody Museum, by actually transitioning from single point to dual point. And we're doing it now in Germany too, because it's just absurd when you have a single point, and maybe we should explain it. When you have a single point setting for your museum, let's say 50 or 55% RH, or 20 degrees Celsius, what happens is that it's fluctuating, as you're saying. It's like a chainsaw, like a saw, right? Like a saw system. So you even in let's say it's summer, you're cooling, temperature goes to 19 degrees. What you do, even if it's outside 38 degrees Celsius, you're starting to heat, and vice versa in winter. It might be minus 10 degrees outside, but with this single point setting, you're starting to cool. You're studying efforts in energy to cool when you have outside minus degrees, and to heat when you have outside almost 40 degrees. And that is, in these times, irresponsible. And it should, and I can, we all have this probably around the globe, that we have to reduce our energy now in the crisis. And our ministry, for example, was asking, please reduce 20% of your energy. 20% saving of energy is a no-brainer just by transitioning from single point to dual point. You already have it.
That's right. Yeah. There was an interesting statistic that came out from the International Energy Agency recently that said 10% of global energy use is utilized in air cooling systems, which is extraordinary, given that they're estimating that the number of air cooling systems in use will triple to 6 billion by 2050. So energy use directed towards cooling systems is skyrocketing now. And it doesn't seem, with a global warming and the desire for people, the tourism potential for cultural heritage, all of these big museums going up, they are all about human comfort. And the solution seems to be, for human comfort, first stop, go to a HVAC system, and not perhaps a passive building that has airflow and other means of cooling. So it seems like such an antiquated approach. So if you're a conservator, conservation scientist, collection manager working in a museum, you've got to be on the front foot. You have got to start those conversations about changing parameters to something broader, because you will gain a lot of energy efficiency.
And maybe why, also, Amanda, we should maybe also mention, why is this so important? I mean, museums are not fossil fuel industry, right? I mean, we know that in Europe, for example, among the 10 largest emitters of carbon, 5 are in Germany. And although our government always tries to explain us that we are like a really green and ecological and on the forefront of like green transformation of our industries, we have 5 of the largest 10 emitters in Europe in our country. Museums are not among them, right? Those are like plants who are burning fossil fuel, coal, oil, and so on. But why museums are so important, I think that's and first of all, because we are working museums, right? So that's where we can work, yeah. But they are also important for 2 reasons. Number one, they are an agora, they are mostly public institutions, and they must be role models for the wider public. I think most of our museums in Germany are public museums, and they have a certain role to really lead this conversation. I mean, not maybe implemented everything, they cannot maybe, but they are the place where people can meet and people can discuss about the challenges of climate crisis. Whether they are art museums, natural history museums, actually our museum in Berlin does it so wonderfully, inviting all those Fridays for Future kids, since they're like demonstrating there. But this is one reason. And the other reason is that if you calculate energy consumption for museums per square area, per square foot or per square meter, you come to the conclusion that museums are among the biggest energy consumers in the urban context. We are using some of our museums, don't want to make too concrete examples, but we are a museum which is visited by okay, maybe 100,000 people, but it uses the energy of 2,000 or 3,000 households per year. A museum, energy consumption of 300, 400 kilowatt hours per square meter in a year is very high, relatively, right? Not in absolute terms, still low on our 70 million kilowatt hours, which we're using in National Museum in Berlin, or at some point we calculated 30,000 tons of CO2 for this. It's always changing and fluctuating, but it's not in absolute terms, it's not so much, but relatively to our area, we are the top consumers. And we saw this at Yale. We're using more energy in museums than in the medical school. That is probably a surprise for many museum people, right? They think, oh, the med school with all those equipment, the computer tomographs, or no, the museums are using more energy per area. And this is because 24/7, they're running HVAC systems.
And that is reflected in Australia as well. Some museums are amongst the highest energy users in their state. So it's that 24/7, and museums in Australia are expanding. Art galleries are expanding. They're not just one building anymore, they're 2 or 3. They're operating off-site storage facilities as well. So they are huge consumers of energy.
And Amanda, one point, because Australia is very far away from Germany, and we really, as Katja said, we're tending to look at everything from our German point of view. And just a question to you: does this debate, which is slowly starting in Europe, that we're living? I mean, we have the digital divide, we have the global north, the global south. Actually, the global north living and working for the last 50 years at the expense of the south, where actually the people have to suffer the most impact from climate crisis. You know, Germany, I think, is number 4 in the emission, in the historic emission chart. Just a small country like Germany on this huge planet, right, is on a number 4 of carbon emitting countries in history. Now, not anymore, but in history. That 60%, you know, of the carbon which is now in the air for the next hundreds and maybe 1,000 years came into the atmosphere in the last 40 years. Actually, more or less in the time since we debate about climate change. It's continuing. How this is discussed in Australia, this kind of, you know, it's also a matter of global climate justice, right? I mean, how does this debate go in Australia?
Well, we have recently had a change in our federal government. So we had probably not a terribly progressive previous government in terms of addressing climate change and greenhouse gas emissions. And that's quite a challenging thing because our Pacific neighbours, the small island Pacific countries, are some of the countries that are experiencing the most devastating effects of climate change with sea level rise. And these are, you know, from a personal perspective of mine, is that in the organisation that I work for, the Queensland Art Gallery and Gallery of Modern Art, these are the communities that we engage with, that we work with, we show their art, we, you know, they collaborate with us. So it is imperative that as an organisation, we're moving as fast as we can towards energy efficiency, because how can you collect the cultural heritage of our closest neighbours but watch those communities suffer? It's just...
Exactly. Exactly. And I think, Amanda, this is what I take away. I mean, I'm a natural scientist, but talking to some of my colleagues from humanities, I take this away too. More and more museum directors are actually questioning the fact, even exhibiting modern artists who make climate crisis a topic of their work. And they say, how can we show them the same way we cannot show, and it's not ethical to show stolen cultural heritage from the global South, right, without provenance, from the colonial context. In the same way, we cannot show modern artists who make climate crisis a topic of their work and continue to run the museums the way we're running them. This is not coming together. I think I'm apologizing, but I got a question from Peter here directly, and I think on the fluctuation, maybe Amanda, you got this too. Somebody was asking us from the public whether we could talk about the speed of fluctuation in our research and recommendation, and not just the upper and lower limits. I'm afraid if we go into this, we're going to need another hour of discussion. Maybe only one sentence. There is a huge gap of knowledge and a huge misunderstanding, in my opinion, about the speed of fluctuations, because nobody really knows what is a short-term fluctuation, what is a long-term fluctuation. ASHRAE considers fluctuation as deviations from the running average, for example, humidity of 30 days and 7 days for temperature. Museumsbund says, not more than 5% fluctuation during a day. We don't really know whether short-term fluctuations or long-term fluctuations are more dangerous or less dangerous unless we really realize what is a short-term fluctuation. Clear is that many materials, if you have a fluctuation within an hour or two, will not even notice that there was a fluctuation, right? Maybe not paper, but other more massive materials will just not even recognize that there has been a fluctuation. And I think that is definitely a gap for research, speed of fluctuations, what is acceptable. And to my interpretation, in most of the standards and recommendation, this is just written without really knowing what it should be.
Exactly.
Actually, what does the AI CCM say about fluctuation, short-term and long-term?
So in 2018, that first guideline that was written with the humid and the temperate, I left in the explanation about fluctuations in 24 hours plus or minus. Personally, I didn't understand it at all. However, my idea was introduce the idea of two different guidelines. That's a bit different. And let people get used to that, have conversations around that. Now with the 2022 revision, that's all gone. All of those all that stuff about fluctuations, which is so confusing, really hard to interpret without, just even interpreting what was said and not having the research to back it up. I could never explain it. So we've taken that out of the guidelines and we're just referring to slow, stable, diurnal fluctuation. That's good. If you do see rapid fluctuations, investigate, take action. That's it.
Exactly. Yeah, this is wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, because I think that goes also along with my interpretation, because we're now on behalf of our Ministry of Culture in Germany making a survey of German museums on the real climate. So we're collecting data, we are evaluating real climate according to ASHRAE and Museumsbund and BISO and all the recommendations which are out there. And it's really tricky. And I admit it's exactly the same for me. All these fluctuations, calculating deviations from running averages, it's very confusing. And actually most museums, or let's say many museums so far, which I'm getting data and evaluating data from, do actually not comply with these rules, which they say, like, not more than 2 Kelvin a day, not more than 5% RH. They are saying it, and they're maybe even writing it down in their facility reports, right? That's we all know. But the reality in the museums is an entirely different one. And so congratulations for removing this and actually admitting that there's a gap of knowledge, gap for more research. And it's not sufficient today to just, postulating and writing that we want to have this, because it has to be like this. But yeah, thank you, Gary Thompson.
Yeah.
So let me be a deviant fluctuator here. We have a lot of questions that are come up in the Slido for you. I wasn't expecting to have to, take you out of the scrum, but here we are. So first question, do you find there is more willingness for changing set points or broadening indoor climate corridors? Agnes Brokerhoff commented that climate corridor is also referred to as bandwidth, just for the people out there. So do you find that there's more willingness for changing these set points?
Well, I'll jump in there. AICCM has just opened up the the collection environment survey for 2022. We did the last one in 2018, and 120 organizations replied to that survey from national, state, regional, and small museums. So it was an incredible amount of information that came in. And we've just opened the 2022 survey. I had a quick look at the data, and about 30 organizations have responded, and the majority are from national and state organizations that run HVAC systems. 75% of those organizations have adopted wider parameters. So that's a great trend.
Yeah, I don't know. I think yes and no. I think in first of all, I think it's a natural thing that stable is safe, and everybody who thinks that 50 plus minus 10 is safe, then they always think 50 plus minus 5 is better. I think that's very natural. There is a tendency to weaken this position, I would say, but as somebody who was fighting against this narrow corridor for 15 years now, and actually experiencing just defeat after defeat after defeat. And I'm not the first one. I mean, I just want to remember people, or actually think about people like Jonathan Ashley Smith, Marion Mecklenburg, on whose shoulders we're actually standing, right? Who actually delivered all this groundwork on what is an acceptable margin of humidity and temperature in a museum. And they also experienced defeats after defeats after defeats, because there is a strong lobby saying, well, we need that. It has softened now when museums realize that they are not able to pay their energy bills. They are simply not able to pay their energy bills. And as actually the ICOM IRC guideline says in 2014, if you are, or actually also ASHRAE, I think it is too, if you are running your museum in a way that you're undermining your own sustainability, that you are just risking the collapse of your institution, then please, what does it help to have a great and narrow climate corridor? So this, knowledge slowly at a glacial pace, I would say, is entering the museum community. Is it fast enough? No. I mean, we had, in my opinion, no. We had this long discussions about this new corridor in Germany in the summer. And you may always see a glass half full, half empty. I signed this recommendation, I endorsed this recommendation together actually with the German Conservation Association VDR, together with the Dörner Institute, our colleagues in Munich. But for me, this is a half empty glass. The 4060 regulation is not enough. So I think we should, as I said in the beginning, I should be more creative, and we should be more realistic on what the futures of museums can and will be.
Okay, we are going from high concept to very clear question, which is a practice-based question. We are currently facing criticism from our insurers. Maybe Amanda can speak about her experience of negotiating their broadening of parameters. So how do you work with this special group, namely the people who are insuring your collections? Because we haven't really talked about that.
It's an interesting question. So from my perspective and my experience, the insurer of the state collection in Queensland is government. And consequently, they're seeking our advice on, and they defer to our knowledge. So they're actually an excellent insurer and are happy to abide by any advice we provide in relation to that. So, and interestingly, we have at the gallery never had a terms and conditions that specify specifically a temperature and RH range. It's always been a statement of intent. And that's, good practice intent that no harm will come to an object. So of course we abide by, temperature and RH parameters that are suitable, but we don't put it in our terms and conditions in our loan agreements. So in that regard, the insurer doesn't really, it's not an issue for the insurer. But when you perhaps are using a commercial insurer, that's when it becomes a little bit more complicated, and they can be far more rigorous in their expectations about the way in which artworks and cultural heritage objects are managed. And I would say it's becoming more and more complicated dealing with insurers, because particularly for transport, less for static insurance where it's on display in a museum because they have confidence, they've worked with museums for a long time, so there's confidence there. But it's actually in the transit where it becomes a more challenging conversation, and it's actually harder to get insurance now.
Right. Do you have any ideas, Stefan, for especially, I think, this negotiation? If you are from a museum that has a private insurance group, perhaps you will be part of the negotiation, but perhaps not, or perhaps you should, as a conservator, try to be part of the negotiation if you aren't already.
Yeah, this is definitely a good question and a very tricky question. I would say I have never actually been sitting in a conversation with insurers. Most cases of the National Museum is state insurance, so we don't have really this issue here. But I think, and I would assume that insurers don't know much more than we do about the danger of fluctuation. We just discussed that, right? they don't really, if they rely on anything in their requirements, they rely on conservators' knowledge and on conservators' experience. And then they are, of course, taking recourse to the loan agreements, to the agreements which are going through the legal counsel in our institutions. And I think we have only one way to move forward. And I think this one way is, as Jonathan Ashley Smith at some point said in 1994 in his famous article, let's be honest. Let us be honest about first the real climate we have in our museums. How many museums are there who are asking from their from the organizations where they're lending to art, asking more tight control than they actually have themselves? That's quite frequent, right? What is written in this facility reports? What is written? We all know, and insurers can only take recourse to these documents. We all know that this is a place where honesty is like not really in its strong suit, right? It's like really a big issue for many organizations. So I think it starts from knowing the truth and knowing the real climate you have in your museum. And once you know that, you will also have then to go back to the table and say, well, this is what we have, and this is what we expect the others to provide. And then this knowledge will eventually also go to the insurers. I'm sure. And it cannot be anymore that we are writing we have 50 plus minus 5% in this collection if we don't have that. And one more point, which is coming very important now in the energy crisis. Many museums don't even have the means to control that. I can give you one example. For example, over the summer, our energy supplier was just lowering the temperature of our hot water supply to the museums. All of a sudden, we couldn't couldn't have 50% anymore, but only 55% in our collections. So it's not in the hands of the museums to control these conditions. It might be somebody else. It might be the city. It might be the big energy plant next door who is actually changing these conditions for you. And you don't even informing the museum, don't even telling them, not even asking, right? Just one day to the other, they decide we're gonna deliver you a hot water with a different temperature. So maybe it would be time then for museums, and I think that's my advice in our discussion here, to inform insurers, to inform collections who are lending the art, that some of these promises which were made on the base of not really real data, but now they cannot be kept because it's not in the power of a museum to make this decision. And I'm not mentioning even the danger of blackout, right? Which we're now discussing in Europe in the energy crisis. I think
and we have in Australia loss of energy, but we've over the last 3 years, last 10 years, we've had 3 floods in Brisbane, which have resulted in loss of energy to the buildings. Yeah. And one of our buildings is a concrete bunker. It's 40 years old now. Yeah, it's about 40 years old. It maintains its conditions for days and days and days without power beautifully. And another building, which is a glass pavilion with a flat roof, that doesn't have that capacity. So, it's these are actually the risks that we're facing.
Yes, exactly.
Loss of energy, flood, pests, with a warming tropical climate, the increase in pest activity.
Yeah,
that's what we talked about all yesterday. So we're creating a chain. We have 2 more minutes, and I think it seems, with the question of honesty, to be the right thing to ask you to comment on this in the last 2 minutes. So the notion that active climate control in tight bandwidth will always work prevails. Systems failures are not shared, leading to a false sense of security. So, in the words of Billy Joel, honesty is such a lonely word. Should we talk more about things that fail so that people will know that they are not aberrant.
Yes. Well, if it's only 2 minutes, it's very short. Yes.
I would agree. Yes, but it's a hard conversation to have because directors probably aren't that keen on having those failures aired because larger organizations like to continue to exchange objects, borrow, lend, major touring exhibitions, things like that. So I think you have to start at the top. The courage to have those conversations has to come from the top because we, as the people who work, the cogs in the machine, we have to have that approval to have those conversations. But they would be that would be a truly formative undertaking.
Maybe we should have an anonymous failure conference. So where we scramble our voices and don't show ourselves, but talk about all of our failures so that at least they can come out.
Yeah, and we could also anonymize this a little bit. I mean, that's our approach in Germany. As I told before, we are doing now a survey on real climate in museums and archives and libraries. And of course, all those museums and institutions which are sending us their data, we give the promise that we're not gonna, put this out on the next day and say, well, look at this museum, what kind of climate do they have? But they get this back for themselves, and we only use it anonymized for our benchmarking. And the same for the energy consumption. We're collecting data for energy consumption for museums, but we're promising actually every museum which is sending us their data that they will get an evaluation for their museums, how they're ranking in the lower third, the middle, or the upper third. They get this evaluation back, yes, but we're not using this data in a form that you can identify and say, oh, look at this museum, they have like this large or whatever consumption. I proceed like that for our museums, right? When I'm criticizing new buildings, yes, I do. But for this majority of the museums which are delivering and submitting their data to us for evaluation on energy consumption and on their real climate, it can be treated confidentially and then used only in the large amount of data that we can say, look, that's where you are. And we will find out how many museums actually comply with the Museumsbund recommendation, and maybe we introduce the AI CCM for comparison as well. And then we will find out how many museums are really complying with this. And I think then the museum directors have this information that they do or do not comply, but we can actually promise confidentiality and only have this knowledge shared among those who are concerned, because this is a major concern, right? People say, should I really send my data to them? Because then it will be, tomorrow they will blame us for having this and this and this. And I think no worries. If we are doing this evaluation, it will be treated confidentially for the moment.
Right. Okay. Thank you so much, Amanda and Stefan. This was very, very exciting. Ended on failure, but failure for the good. We will now take a short break before our speaker session. See you at the top of whatever hour you are in currently. And please use the time to suggest any breakout rooms in the chat to technical support if you are so inclined. All right, see you again in 2 minutes. Hello, everyone. Welcome back from our extremely short break. I hope you're all completely refreshed. I want to remind you during the talks, if you have questions for our speakers, please put them in the Slido. There will be separate partitions for each of our speakers for your questions. And also don't forget to rate questions. All right. Welcome, speakers. Our first talk is with Mutanu Kyany'a. Please turn on your video. Hello.
Hello. Hey, Kaja.
Hi. Mutanu is the Programs and Outreach Coordinator at African Digital Heritage. a digital society scholar, Mutanu works with African communities to identify how they can use technology to protect, preserve, and promote their culture and heritage assets. She has extensive experience in designing holistic digital approaches that support research and innovation in the cultural sector. Take it away, Mutanu.
Please give me a minute to share my screen. Sorry, am I sharing my screen?
Yes, you are.
Okay, thank you. My name is Mutanu, as you have heard. I am based in Nairobi, Kenya. I work for an organization called the African Digital Heritage. So what do we do at African Digital Heritage? We are a nonprofit organization, and we say that we work at the intersection of culture and technology. So what this basically means is we are not a museum, we are not an archive, we are not a library, but we work with practitioners in these spaces to provide digital solutions on how they can digitize their artifacts, their monuments, things that they hold. So we focus on digitization itself, but we take these practitioners through the whole process of digitization. So why do you want to digitize? What is it that you want to digitize? What platforms do you want to use in your digitization process? What do the laws in your country state about digitization? Who holds the copyright to these things that you want to digitize? We also look at things like access. Who are you digitizing for? Where are they? Will it be free? Will it be open? And stuff like that. So through the whole process, and then think about like a sustainability plan after. I like this line where we say we connect the past to the present, and in turn we help shape the futures. And for this talk, I'm going to take you through two projects that we have worked on, digitization projects that and are somewhat connected to climate change. And I'm sure by now some of you are asking, so what does digitization have to do with climate change? The previous speaker kind of touched a little bit on that, but maybe from my perspective, I think climate change represents one of the greatest threats to cultural heritage as we know it. So we have things like physical damage and increasing temperatures, we have fires, we have floods, we have droughts, for like now the tangible heritage things. And then in terms of intangible heritage, communities are changing the way that they used to live, because now we are seeing very many cases of people having to move from their ancestral land. It's also changing how, let's say, their farming methods. It's also changing how then they would pass on knowledge about their communities and their cultures from one generation to another. This is all thanks to climate change, by the way. So how we say that we connect the past with the present and then at least help shape the futures is that we believe that through digitization, we are able to at least document this one stories and two documents, like monuments and artifacts. And in some way, since now we have records of this, we are able to see what have people done to mitigate some of these changes that have come up with climate because of climate change, and then how then can we maybe borrow some of their lessons to influence our futures. Recently, the COP27 was held in Egypt, and I remember someone saying that unfortunately, in like the next 100 years, the pyramids of Egypt as we know them might not exist. Again, thanks to climate change. And the focus on this COP27 was addressing loss and damage, especially to like vulnerable populations and developing countries. But I think that it's about time that cultural heritage and history is not defined by loss and damage. Thus, the need to act fast and to act now, which is what we are helping practitioners, mostly in Africa, think about what are the mitigation measures that they can put in place such that they do not lose these things, and again, they can influence their futures and also for future generations, really. So let's get to the two projects that I was talking about. First, we were part of a team that helped digitize Gede ruins. This is Gede ruins this was in May 2022. This photo was taken in May 2022. So maybe let me give you a little bit of background about the Gede ruins. The Gede ruins are located it's called Gede now, but it's in Malindi along the Kenyan coast. It spans 45 acres and it dates back to 1041. Unfortunately, it was abandoned in the 1700s. When you go to the ruins, you will see that it was a perfectly planned city with single-storied buildings that were built with coral and limestone. There's a palace, there are tombs, there are mosques. Like, this was an exquisite city. And they even had a planned drainage system. And this was in 1041 with like flashing toilets in Africa. So it was like, from its architecture, you can tell that it was a Swahili city. But unfortunately, you cannot find stories about thriving Gede in available historical records or even local folklore. The earliest record was done in 1920, but the earliest record that you can find about Gede ruins was in 1920 by an archaeologist called George Kirkman. So what we know about Gede right now are basically speculations. So people ask, so why was this very exquisite city then abandoned? From the history, you can tell that it was abandoned twice. So it was abandoned first in the 1500s and then finally in the 1700s. So in the 1500s, they say maybe because of the raids along the Kenyan coast or because of the Portuguese defeated the Sheikh of Malindi and then took over like the cities. But no one knows why it was abandoned again in the 1700s. So they claim that it's, again, raids by the Gala. And maybe there are signs, when you go to the ruins, that there are wells that you can see keep on going deeper and deeper. So one of the other speculations is maybe the falling water table was why they had to really move. So in my next slide, this is the well that I'm talking about, but I'll show you, I'll take you through a virtual tour of what Gede is right now. Can you see, sorry, I need to stop sharing so that I can share this screen for the virtual tour. So this is Gede as we know it right now. As I said, there are no physical records of thriving Gede. The only inscription that we have is of this tomb that was dated in 10028 AH. And from a city that was very good, this is what is remaining. So it's just debris, and you can clearly see that it was coral and limestone. Maybe let's take a look at the palace right now. This was the palace reception court. And this was the palace reception court. This is how the palace looks like inside. Maybe we can look at the mosque. Sorry, can you still see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Okay. So this is the mosque. This is what it looks like outside with all the coral and stuff, but I can leave a link at the chat. You can go through the virtual tour by yourself because it might take us a while. So
just wanting to tell you, you have 5 more minutes.
Oh, 5 more minutes. Okay,
yes.
So maybe, sorry. So maybe you're asking, why should we digitize right now? As I had said, so one of the very many reasons is access, which I have just done. You could see Gede as it is in 2022 from wherever you're joining from. But apart from that, we believe that digitization helps us document sites across time for future generations. And at least future generations won't have speculations as we have right now of maybe why Gede was people fled from Gede, and because we have digitized right now, they can say this is what Gede looked like in 2022. But apart from it, I really like the part that then we are contributing to already existing history with factual data. One of the many things about digitization is that I like to call it crowdsourcing for information, because now, because of the digitization, and now people have greater access to stories. And here we are saying nobody knows what happened in Gede. Remember when I was telling you that the earliest record was in 1920 by J. Kirkman? We recently, there was a girl who knew that her father or her grandfather, I've forgotten, her father worked at Gede as an archaeologist. But when you go to the books, it only states, it's only showing the work of John Kirkman. So at least now this girl went through the archives, went to the Kenya National Museums, and they were able to dig up records. And now this month, there's going to be an exhibition of like Gede in the 1940s. So at least we'll have photos of that, which have been sourced from these families. We'll have photos of that. And then also we are also including the African story. So it's not just J. Kirkman, it's J. Kirkman plus this team of 60 archaeologists who helped him in the archaeological project. But the thing I like about digitization then again is that we're able to provide data and proof as grounds for restoration and protection. For example, right now, we can look at the photos that we took in 2022, and we can look at the photos that were taken in 1940, and then say, you can clearly see that maybe this is a historical monument. Maybe we need to put in more funds for it so that it can at least serve several generations and it can be protected and restored. So the next one is digitizing libraries. I'm going to brush through this very fast because I only have, like, let's say now 3 minutes. So we were part of a project that was digitizing the Macmillan Memorial Library. The Macmillan Memorial Library in Kenyan history is the oldest library in Nairobi, but it's also the second oldest library in Kenya. It dates back to the late 1800s, and when it started, it was predominantly white. So when we were called on this project, again, thinking about damage and loss, most of the documents that were in the library were in bad shape, because again, because of the exposure to elements like now we have again, sunlight, humidity levels have changed and stuff like that. So we needed to save the ones that are most at risk. So what this entailed is we were able to build the first digital catalog in the library, and then we digitized items that are now publicly available to anyone who needs to view it. And then again, this gave the rise to the birth of Build Your Archive. So Build Your Archive was from the realization, because now this library was predominantly white, the library did not have records of Kenyan stories or Kenyan people at most, even the photos. So what Build Your Library entailed was we did a tutorial on how someone can digitize their family photographs or their albums or report cards, if you may, or kipande, which ID, which was used during the colonial times, how they can digitize things that they hold dear in their family and then be able to share with them. And then also now at the library, if you want to digitize your own personal records, they have booths there where you can find, and you think that the tutorial won't do it for you. They have booths there where you can go and take your items, and then they can help you digitize. I'm so sorry I rushed to the second project. Yeah, thank you. That's it from me.
Thank you so much. And we'll get to more perhaps of the projects or how they're happening in the question and answer session.
Okay.
Hi, Joel.
Hi.
Joel, Joel
to-
Taylor is a senior researcher at the Norwegian Institute for Cultural Heritage Research, NICU. Working in the fields of heritage studies and conservation, he's published on sustainable approaches to conservation, preventive conservation, heritage values, conservation theory and decision-making, intergenerational justice, politics and policy, and heritage and digital humanities. Take it away, Joel. So we will have, just to let you know, we will have until approximately 9:50 or 50 after whatever hour you're in for your presentation, and then we will go into the question and answer.
Right. Well, I was asked for 15 minutes, so I can't really change it too much right now, but
Yeah.
I'll see where I can go. Anyway, so I'll start. Can you see the screen?
Yes.
Great. So my name is Joel Taylor. As I kind of picking up a little bit on the discussion session, I'm going to be talking about museum loans and in particular their specifications and implications for sustainability. And I'm going to be talking about some of the work I did with my colleague, Caitlin Spangler-Bickel, whilst we were at the Getty Conservation Institute, where we examined some of the reasons behind the slow change in low specifications, despite this sort of global and long-standing calls for change that we heard about in the discussion. And loan specifications may seem like a detail, but these agreements can often dictate or at least strongly influence museum climate policies are all around the museum and also in storage. So just to kind of position this a little bit, like other people, I've questioned the notion of ideal conditions before. We've known for a long time that the ±5 was based on technological possibility, not risk. And Gary Thompson was very clear about that back in 1986. We've known that 50 ±5, it favors moderate temperate environments like Northern Europe, much more than other parts of the world, including many parts of the global South. And this influences how risks are understood. And we've been around the science long enough to know that there's never going to be complete certainty in these things. And from working with standards and guidance, things like the ASHO chapter, we see that every set of numbers, even a museum policy, has a story behind it, whether or not that story is fully known. So the scientific research, I mean, it's vital, it's really important, but it's also important to look beyond those numbers. The reality of all this is about people making decisions in uncertain situations. Choosing between a narrow and a broader range for climate creates these kind of polarizing factions. Stefan was talking about the stable is safe, and a lot of that kind of discussion there. And we kind of access to up-to-date knowledge is absolutely a factor, but we know enough to kind of get rid of this idea that ±5 is a gold standard for all kinds of collections, and kind of focusing on the technical kind of reinforces this idea that this was the only factor. But the context is something I'd like to talk about. Context is crucial here. Loans involve a wide range of people who have different needs, different responsibilities, and also different sources of information. Those people don't always get to see the whole process. Very few people see the whole process of a loan. And they often involve different institutions with different collections, sometimes different climate zones, sometimes different missions of why that institution exists. So how people make the actual decisions about their loan specifications, it's a different matter. And we felt this required an interdisciplinary study. Not least because loans involve more than one institution, and institutions might change their climate specifications when lending, but that wouldn't mean that others would necessarily change theirs when the same institution wanted to borrow. So to widen the discourse and step out from my kind of conservation perspective, I work with Caitlin, who's an anthropologist, to kind of map out the larger loan landscape and to understand what factors might be inhibiting this change that we've been waiting for. So we took an applied anthropology lens, which prompted us to not only look at climate requirements, but at the greater context of professional culture surrounding loans. So during the 1 year we developed a methodology to gather the perspectives professionals from various fields, from those in the museum to external disciplines like insurance and art law. You can see a range of places and types and professions here. So we conducted 29 interviews, both formal and informal, and that was with over 40 professionals, either individually or sometimes together with other colleagues from the institution. And although our time was limited and it was during the COVID year, so it was a bit of a crunch, but we tried to get a range of professionals, as you can see. And in the field of applied anthropology, investigation shouldn't be limited to the issue alone, that specific issue alone, because often insights arise in places that might not seem directly related. So identifying some of the unseen factors that influence decision-making for loans would help us understand the true cost of changing the status quo. And because loans are complex processes that involve such a wide cross-section of professionals, it's difficult for each actor to see exactly how they're connected to the larger whole. And they don't always understand how their actions can impact the work of their colleagues or the reasons and logic behind the actions of others. So many of the curators we talked to, they said that they didn't think they were involved in the loan process at all, and we should talk to registrars. They don't see themselves as part of that system, even though they're often the driving factors that would be requesting these objects, the people that initiate the loans in the first place, and often the most powerful players. So there's an uncertainty that comes from being embedded in a process that you can't see in its entirety. And what happens is that people start working on assumptions that they make about the other actors involved. So real cross-disciplinary conversations that could open up pathways to change are kind of inhibited. So we've seen cases of institutions where the conservator and the registrar were both personally on board with broadening their climate parameters, but each one assumes that the other would never agree to it. So the conversation never even begins. So we call that imagined conflict. We also saw what we call imagined harmony with museum workers who said that climate control conditions for loans are often dictated by the insurance, even though the insurance underwriters told us that they were happy to follow whatever the industry standard is. So in the end, everyone is just deferring to everyone else. No one sees how they impact the final result because they think the decisions are being made by other people. So there's also uncertainty in terms like the industry standard, which we heard often, with many people saying that they follow the industry standard without being able to say where those numbers came from or how they compare to the most up-to-date research. And also people unsure of what it might be these days, even if they are connected to the research. And this propagates this idea that there is an industry standard that everyone asks for, whereas the actual kind of behavior of the industry is that the wider range of people actually agree to after negotiation. So there is, but this idea of a magic number that everyone knows, but no one knows where it came from, was quite persistent there. And kind of speaking of negotiations, of what comes after this magic number, much of the discourse around loans uses terms. People would use terms related to the marketplace, with our participants talking about negotiation and bargaining, reciprocity, even horse trading. It's transactional, and all market transactions have to be predicated on a degree of trust. There are many different kinds of uncertainty involved in loans, and they're compounded if there isn't already that trust and familiarity between institutions. And this can cause anxiety about not being able to control for all the variables. And so people often search for a proxy or a substitute to replace that feeling of control. Well, you can control what climate parameters you specify. And as we were told by one interviewee, a borrowing institution might fight to meet strict guideline parameters to build up that reputation of trusted ability, regardless of what they think, if they think those climate parameters are necessary for the safety of the object. We also heard a lot of people talking about being a good neighbor and trusting in the professional competence and capacity of their colleagues in the museum world, even though there was unfamiliarity and uncertainty. But the flip side of this is that there's also mistrust, either based on suspicion or a specific incident that damages trust. Mistrust can manifest itself in loan conditions that feel unfair, retaliatory, or even punitive to the borrower. Some of our interviewees described this as happening to them as borrowers. But even though they felt it was unnecessary, they went along with it because they really wanted the loan. And this demonstrates how relationships of trust are not always equal, how power differentials come into play. Because sometimes loans just have to happen. You have to make it work. Often this comes from the level of directors who are thinking about loans in a much bigger, broader sense of cultural diplomacy and of building relationships. But of course, it's easier for some institutions just to make something happen because they have more resources to find solutions, or more influence to make the other museum find solutions. So a number of smaller or mid-sized museums told us that large, prestigious organizations making loan specifications that seemed unnecessary and that required a significant chunk of their resources that actually had to reroute from their own permanent collections. But they did it anyway. So people don't always see how their actions or position affects others in a process. So sometimes people don't even realize the power they hold in a negotiation and what it means for those on the other side. And to be fair, it isn't only large and prestigious institutions that request requirements that seem excessive to borrowers. Institutions of all kinds and sometimes request stricter climate parameters for an outgoing loan than that same object normally experiences at home in storage, which can be quite dangerous even. So the hierarchy and authority structures within an institution can also affect climate specifications. We have many people say that their climate specs were implemented by their predecessors or more senior staff, and they didn't feel it was their place to make any changes. Others didn't feel that they had a voice in conversations about climate. Whether this is just a lack of agency, it's just perceived because of some kind of professional humility. It also contributes to that institutional inertia. So when we talk about changing climate specifications, we're really talking about having to tackle all of these other influencing factors I've described, multiple complex interconnected systems. Each institution is unique in a way. It has its own structure, policies, and culture at work within it. And since loans at least have two institutions involved, we have to think about that dynamic between the institutions and how that impacts further decisions. And finally, more practical issues arise with the way these diverse institutions interface with one another, in the way they communicate and negotiate. So all this makes it very clear that we can't just talk about the numbers anymore. We have to talk about these professional cultures with distinct values, different currencies, and feel the cost of changing in many ways. So as I mentioned earlier, if an institution changes its parameters for lending, making a less energy-intensive exhibition for the borrower, it doesn't mean that other institution will offer those specifications in return. So the local benefit is to those other institutions, but the perceived risk is to the lender. So it's almost as if institutions are penalized for widening their specifications before others do. So there's a cost to changing. Individuals may not be involved in borrowing and lending or individual institutions. But even if the institution is, it's hard to know if you're being a good neighbor. So although this was just an exploratory study, I didn't want to leave you just with these problems. And here are some kind of things that can happen internally and across institutions. So one of these things is realizations come just in having these conversations through self-reflection and hearing other opinions. Almost everyone felt powerless and that others had greater influence. Often people felt that there was resistance where people were waiting for the other one to speak up. Institutions can move just through that from risk avoidance to risk management. And guidance has to come from trusted sources and examples from powerful actors in the field, not just saying these things, but actually seeing it happen. So some sectors, they don't have sources or signals. And in these powerful positions, those in powerful positions aren't always the first to recognize a problem. So institutional change is not enough alone. It can come at a cost, but bringing about change in our professional cultures can ease these pressures, which require reaching across disciplines and sharing resources and discussions. So I hope, yep, we're kind of in time. So thank you very much to everyone for that, and I can stop sharing my screen or somehow.
No, please don't, because now we're going to start our question and answer to all three speakers. Thank you, Joel. Okay, let's start with Mutanu. Your first question, highly rated. Are the digitization helpers at the library always available, or are they project funded? It's such a great idea to help people add to the archive like that. But I think people are really worried that those people are going to go away if they're project funded. So tell us a little bit more about the structure, the infrastructure of that project.
They were project funded because it was part of a funded project. But again, as I said, we joined this as digital advisors, but we are working with the owners of the project, Book Bank Trust, are working on making sure that there's a permanent booth at the libraries.
And is it just at one library, or are there multiple libraries?
No, so Macmillan Library, so Book Bank Trust manages 3 libraries in Nairobi. So there's this Macmillan Library that is situated in the Nairobi CBD, and then they have Kaloleni Library and Makadara Library, which are also in Nairobi, but kinda at the communities, not at the city center.
Great. And are people looking at this in smaller libraries as well, and more outside of Nairobi?
Yes, but now I'm not sure if there are people who have set up a booth that can help the community, but when they do come, we always refer them to this tutorial that we shot and is available on YouTube on how then one can personalize, how one can digitize their personal archives.
I know from the US context that there are some projects that have created buses or trucks that go into rural areas and show people how to do these things, even with very internet internet, which also exists in rural parts of the US. So that might be also an interesting idea.
Yeah, that's an interesting idea. Thank you.
On the road, because
I'll remember to share it to the team.
there are the buses that have libraries in them sometimes, so the book buses, and so one could couple that if there's the tradition also in Kenya. Great, thanks. All right, Joel, do you have any suggestions for how to address the hierarchy and trust issues in loan agreements? Who is best placed to start this? Can't hear you.
I think in a way, there's been a lot of discussion which has already taken place. A lot of good work is actually happening out there. But I think that the real thing in terms of that question, the way it's phrased, is that we have to work together. And that's what I'm saying, that doing things in your institution can make it harder sometimes, but actually working together, working with professional bodies. There are lots of declarations out there already. There are lots of conferences about this, often within a discipline. And I think this kind of new wave, what people are talking about now is moving out to other areas. And also coming forward. Sometimes people are waiting for you to come forward. I've seen people, like, when it comes to that decision, like saying, oh, it's, who am I to be the one to give this range or to make this policy? And then it gets made by an external HVAC engineer or an architect who's read a manual from the 1980s written for directors saying, oh, well, ±5, that's the thing, that's the standard. So there's an element of being ready for that, and partly making sure that these signals work across disciplines. So it isn't just this adversarial thing all the time. It's also helping those people in a hierarchy to see the landscape that they don't see. A lot of them are very nice people who care about these things, but don't necessarily see. Not all of them. Some of them like the power, but there's an opportunity to kind of present the case from those different perspectives. So when these signals are created, they need to back these things up. And I think, it's becoming more and more urgent, and it's harder and harder to kind of plausibly deny these things.
Great. I just wanted to mention, all of these talks that we've heard today are relatively disparate, maybe. There's a cornucopia or a bouquet of offerings, but I just wanted to ground us in the fact that it's all about protecting collections. And then we can see that protecting collections often means dealing with hierarchies and people, because it's not just actually about the objects, it's about everyone who wants to deal with the objects. So let's come back, Mutanu, with a question that's about the objects. Data and digitized objects are very vulnerable for loss and damage. How are you protecting the archive? And does climate change have anything to do with how you're planning the archive process or the archival process?
Yes, very much. So in the libraries, it was actually a climate change funded project, because as I mentioned, the books were really, the collections that they had in the libraries were really in a bad shape, because again, because of what's the word that I'm looking for? Because of exposure to again, different forms of sun and humidity and temperature and stuff. And this library has existed for like 100 years now. So of course, the collections that they had there were in a form that could not be used. So how do we ensure that these collections are able to be used by the people who live within the city right now? And so that's why we had to digitize these collections, and also, again, restore them even in physical form. Make sure that the digitized collections, again, it's not just about digitization and access there. Look at the next 5 years and how can these collections be sustainable, and how do you go improving and also backing them up, such that, again, we are not being characterized by loss and damage as we had with the physical copies.
Okay, I think maybe the question is more about your servers and where they are, and can you protect them, and whether you're thinking about the sustainable aspect of the infrastructure to keep the digital data.
The sustainable aspect of keeping the data. Yes, of course. That's why I said that there's a sustainability plan, and making sure that as we are trying to combat climate change, even with the technologies that we're introducing, we are not contributing to the carbon footprint.
Okay, thanks. So maybe Joel, you can talk about how we get away from preaching to the converted and getting the people who have the power to listen within these conversations that different institutions are having. Did you have any luck figuring out how that might happen?
I mean, I think one thing, there's no magic bullets in this. I think we've seen that there's, there was reference to the plus minus dilemma. That was 2010. We've had things from the National Museum's Directors Conference in these areas. So I think a lot of it is that a lot of these signals and a lot of the things that people are saying are just quite weak signals. And I think what we're beginning to see now is more people doing things. So there was a question in the bank about large, high-profile institutions who have 40 to 60 as their default guidance. And that's the kind of thing which changes it, because people talk about this marketplace. People saying, oh, we're going to make things, we're going to change the price of things, doesn't affect things as much as changing the market rate, and people actually being quite open about this. And another aspect of this is when we spoke to smaller and medium-sized museums, we say, oh, why do you have this? Why do you have this range? They say, oh, well, because Museum X would never lend to us. And Museum X was always a prestigious institution that you've heard of. And then we talked to Museum X, and sometimes I knew people from Museum X, and they had actually made these changes already. So there needs to be consistency there, and that needs to be called upon more. But it's a joint thing, and it's also like we were talking about. It's in the creation of museums. These things we need to update a lot of sources. A lot of people. A lot of people would be telling me about the need for 55 plus minus 5 based on information they'd received in the 80s. So a lot of it needs to be reaching out to places, but there's work happening. There are registrars kind of moving into this. There are kind of museums where things Amanda can talk about some of the things which are happening where things are on the ground working, and it's to point to those examples and to say that it is possible now. And with the energy crisis, again, there's more reason for people to see, and that it's not fun to say, but often the financial aspect is a bigger driver than kind of the world literally being on fire sometimes. So there are different things, but it's a concerted effort.
Okay. Wait, you've frozen, alas, Joel.
Anyway, I'll stop talking now and let someone else.
Okay, thanks. You were frozen for a moment for me.
Oh, okay. Maybe that's a sign.
Fire or ice. All right, Mutanu. As with all digitization projects, how do you warrant long-term accessibility to the results of your efforts? Because the digital world is constantly changing.
I love this question. This is an absolutely good question. So maybe let me give you a backstory. At the Kenya National Archives, there had been digitization projects done in the 90s. So we are talking magnetic tapes, cassettes, and stuff. But the thing about funded projects is that then they entail just a certain period. For example, that we are going to digitize this collections for like 2 years. But our question here with our sustainability plan is we help the practitioners to think about to always be coming back to like 3 years or 3 and 5 years, have a sit down and say, are the technologies that we use to digitize our collection serving us now? And if not, how then do we migrate them to the technologies of the day? Because as we are experiencing in Kenya is that we have a lot of information that is unfortunately stuck in magnetic tapes. So now we have to, again, put in a lot of funding to even get new machines to now read these magnetic tapes in order to convert that into digitized formats that can be used now. So one of our sustainability plan is to help practitioners think long-term, not just this money is for 2 years, but then how will these digitized objects serve us in the next 10 years? Yeah.
Great, thank you. Joel, here is the last question of our round. It is, Does the current energy crisis already have an effect on loosening the climate requirements for loans? Is there discussion about this?
To answer the second bit first, yes. It's very difficult to really see if it's having an effect on loans because they're private things, and there are so many. It's very difficult to say here is a trend which is happening, because people, for good reason, don't disclose this information all that readily. But yeah, it's changing the conversation, and it's changing who is interested in the conversation and who is at the table. And I think it's one of these things where now it's moving, as I said before, it's moving beyond the disciplines, and people are beginning to see these things. People are beginning to look for solutions. So I think people are more ready to hear these things. So I can only hope that this does. Then there's the if it involves more traveling exhibitions or more people traveling to exhibitions, there's a kind of a take back issue there. But there's definitely that potential, and I feel that things are slowly progressing. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Take a look at what you might want to do, which breakout rooms you might want to visit. And when you return, you'll be able to choose from 3 types of rooms, meet the speaker, chat about a topic, and drink a virtual coffee. So please make your choices. When we return in 2 minutes, which should be around 16 past whatever hour you're in currently. See you then.